Hi everyone, this is Navika, a cloud engineer, Microsoft most valuable professional, and a LinkedIn top voice in cloud computing. I warmly welcome each one of you to the 18th episode of Tech Chat with Navika, wherein today we would be discussing about Azure Functions. And to help us understand a bit more better, we have a very prominent speaker with us today, Thiago Custódio. Thiago is a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in Azure category for consecutive 9 years. He is an extremely experienced professional, having more than 20 plus years of working experience in the IT industry. Currently, he is working as an Azure App Modernization Consultant at Exhibia United States. His technical expertise lies in the area of cloud, Azure, and everything related to it. He has been making significant amount of impact in the community by his amazing contributions. Thank you so much, Thiago, for joining me in today.
Thank you for inviting me and for the warm introduction.
It's my pleasure. All right, then I just cannot wait to start the episode and deep dive into Microsoft Azure functions. All right, then. Okay, so let's consider a serverless computing solution which provides us in deploying and creating our code directly without worrying about the underlying infrastructure. And that too, which is time and cost efficient. That's exactly what we are going to be discussing in today's episode, that is Azure Functions. So, to start with our first question, Thiago, would you like to just touch base and help us understand what Azure Function is all about at the first place?
Sure. So before I jump into Azure Functions, let me just explain a little bit about cloud computing in general. So before functions or serverless, there was only virtual machines, and then you pay for the allocation of the server, right? However, if you didn't have anything to compute, you still pay, or you would still be charged because you are allocating that server, right? But it goes against one of the selling points for the cloud, which is you pay for only what you use, right? So then, back in 2000, end of 2015, there was the launch of Azure Functions, which is exactly to solve this problem. You basically write code which gets executed from a trigger event. So you only get charged if there is demand, or in other words, if there is an event to trigger that piece of logic, and you only pay for the amount of resources used to compute or to produce whatever that code needs to do. And that's the main shift in you know the difference between virtual machines and functions as a service, because you only get charged if there's the event. That's the main difference, and part of the reason why I like it so much is because it's so easy to get started and you can create really robust solutions.
Right. That's nice, and thank you for explaining the difference actually at the first place,
Mhm.
because that is right. That's what it stands for, right? Serverless computing, and it only gets consumed when you're running your particular function, and for the rest of the time you don't have to pay for it. You're absolutely correct. Also, I think this also answers the question as to why should one go in for Azure Function. I think your first question actually answers that as well. But would you like to add something to it?
Sure. So in before serverless or before functions, we actually need to schedule a job, for example, to check if there's some data that needs to be processed, or to check or to query a specific table every X minutes or every X seconds. And again, this may be a waste of resource because there is the possibility that nothing changed since the past execution or the past trigger, right? And with functions is the opposite. Um, you know, the function gets executed because there is new data or jobs that needs to be done. So we call this a push model rather than a pull model. So rather than you go to the database or to message queue or whatever, it's the data source and pull. This data is pushed to your function and then it gets executed. So there are many scenarios for that. For example, one that I like a lot, and I even wrote a blog post about it. Imagine, for example, that you want to translate text to different languages, right? You can create a blob with the original language, could be English, for example, and then as soon as you upload the text file to blob storage, for example, it will trigger an Azure function which will translate to the language that you need and then output the translated text to a different location or to a different blob, right? So this is a good scenario. Another one, for example, people use this a lot. Let's say you have a video solution and you let people upload in the quality that they want, right? However, especially with modern mobile phones, you can create really high quality video, which in the end will consume a lot of space, right? So you can let the users upload the video the way it was originated or recorded, sorry, and then you translate or you encode to different resolutions or different formats in a way that will keep the quality, but at the same time will require less storage. So again, the same idea, you store the video into blob storage, your function gets triggered, it will encode or create the video in a different format, and in the end it will require less storage to save the data, and it will even get loads faster in the end user device.
You're absolutely right, and I think that also I think that Azure Functions can be used for repetitive tasks as well, right? I mean, as you just mentioned about that, that language change of a particular document, right? You want to turn it into English, or even in general, like for example, if we have alerting, right? If we have some alertings in place, or if you want to send some automated mails, I think even for those purposes, right, Azure Functions can be a good choice.
Yeah, definitely. So nowadays people get notified in Microsoft Teams or Slack or Discord,
Correct.
right? You can use Azure Functions as the webhook. And again, it only gets executed once you need to notify a particular team or channel whenever something happens. So it's a good scenario.
Right.
I often like to browse on Microsoft use case. So they have a dedicated page where customers share their stories. And there's an interesting case from Fuji, if I'm not wrong. So they have a solution where they sell baseball cards, and they do image recognition, who was the player on that particular photo or that particular card. So it's all powered by functions. So there is the image, and then it triggers a function. The function will call Azure AI Services, which was the former Azure Cognitive Services, and it will go to the image detection or they have a specialized model to recognize the players, but it's all powered by functions. So it's a
Right.
really powerful and interesting case.
That's right. It's like entirely automation. And as you just mentioned in your answer, also just like a couple of few seconds back, that it gets integrated with the cognitive services like Azure AI, and then also you mentioned about how there are certain events that trigger the flow of the Azure function, right? So we
Yes,
can say, all in all, we can say that actually it works in the Azure functions work in the concept of triggers and bindings, right?
yes, yes.
Trigger, something that initiates the Azure function, and binding, that's like an integration with other resources. So I think it'll be good to take this as a separate question wherein you can explain a workflow, a bit of it, in terms of trigger and bindings? And also, if you can let us know that what are the different types of bindings that Azure Functions actually supports?
Sure. So again, the trigger is what starts the execution of the function. It could be, for example, HTTP trigger. Someone send HTTP call to your function endpoint, and
Mm-hmm.
as a binding, you have access to the headers, the request payload, and so on. But it could also be, for example, someone create a message in a message queue, Azure Service Bus, for example, right? So the trigger is the event of creating the message in the queue, and the binding would be the message itself. So whatever was the content and the metadata of that message, you have access in your function, and basically you can interact in the way you want, basically. But it could
Mm-hmm.
be something different. For example, Azure Cosmos DB, it has something very interesting, which is called the change feed. So whenever there's a change in a document, the change feed is like a change repository where all the changes got sync to the change log, and you can trigger an Azure function whenever there's a change in a document. So this way, for example, you will know what was the change or who performed that change. So the binding, you'll have access to the document itself. What else? Uh, the another possible event, but then there won't be any binding. But you can schedule a function to get executed using a cron format, for example. So this is the scenario that you mentioned, repetitive tasks. So for example, every month you need to delete data from a particular storage or a database, for example, data that it won't be used, or it's just occupying space, but in reality you won't do anything with that. So you can either move to a different location, which will be cheaper, or you can delete forever in case it won't be used at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
What else? Well, there are different other possible triggers and bindings, but in summary, it's pretty much what originated the function to get executed, and then some data if it's relevant to that particular trigger.
Right. I have a very impromptu question over here. Since we're talking about bindings and integrations, now we know that in serverless computing, we just pay for the time
Mhm.
the server is getting utilized, right? But I mean, hypothetically, for example, if we have in a particular Azure function, I have certain integrations with different resources.
Mhm.
Let's Azure AI storage, hypothetically. So does that affects the cost of Azure function, or it doesn't?
Yeah. So the way Azure functions, the way you get charged actually, it's let me rephrase. There are different ways for you to use Azure Functions. One way, which is the one we are talking about, is the consumption one. In the consumption one, there are two variables. The number one is the number of times the function get executed, and the second variable is the resources used, to during the execution. So they call this gigabytes per second, and they offer like a free tier, a free number of executions and a free amount of gigabytes per second. So you only pay if you exceed that quota. Okay. The other way, if you already have, for example, the app service, there's a cost associated to app service because you are allocating the server, right? However, you can deploy the Azure function there, and it doesn't matter how many times it gets executed or the resources you use, because it's already part of the package, right? And there are some variations. So they also have the, I think it's called premium. I forgot the name, sorry, but it's a variation of the consumption tier, because this is important to mention as well. Because you only pay based on the trigger and the amount of resources, right? It means that there is a delay since the event starts until it produces the output. This is called
Correct.
cold start, right? So there
Yeah,
are
absolutely.
some tiers or some some tiers, pricing tiers for the Azure Functions, which will reduce this cold start. But on the other hand, you pay because your function will be pre-warmed. This is what they call, right? But anyway, those are the different pricing tiers, and again, it depends on your scenario, right? If you don't care about the cold start, you can use consumption, or if it's a problem for you, you can go to more expensive tiers where you have pre-warmed functions.
Got it. Got it.
But
Thanks.
sorry, going back to your answer, to your question, sorry. Besides the Azure Functions, if you are using some other services like the AI services, yes, you also pay for that, but they have a different pricing tier for that. I think the AI service is per call, if I'm not wrong. So there's a fixed price associated to each call.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you for the explanation. Um, Now, as in the beginning, when I introduced about Azure Functions, when I gave the introduction, I had mentioned that, of course, we don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure at all. And we just have to, work on creating and deploying our code. And as we talk about deploying our code to the Azure function, so I'm sure there must be different deployment methods of lead technologies that we can adopt in Azure functions, right? And the reason why I'm taking this as a question, taking this up as a question is because like we have different scenarios where we use Azure function. It could be in the testing phase, it could be in the pre-production and the production. So I mean, there are different ways how you deploy the code then, right? So I would love to hear something from you on that.
Yeah. So again, it depends on your scenario because,
Mm-hmm.
for example, right now I'm working with a client which has specific requirements in terms of compliance. So they need to be PCI DSS compliance. They need to be SOC 2 compliant, and because of that, they do need to have separated environments. So one environment it's not at all shared with the other, and this is actually a recommended practice not only for security concerns but in terms of performance as well, because you won't have your production
Mm-hmm.
environment affected by someone doing some performance test or some other test, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ideally that's what you need to target, different environments. And the way you deploy your function to there, ideally you also have GitHub Actions or Azure Build to build your Azure function, and then you use either GitHub Actions or Azure Release Pipelines to deploy to this specific environment. So this is the proper way to do it. In the past, you could write your Azure functions directly in the portal, but to me, this was more like I need to do something real quick, and it's just for testing purpose, or it won't be for production environment at all. You could alter your function directly in the portal, but nowadays it's not possible anymore. You need to deploy something.
Mm-hmm.
So that
That's right.
that's the
Even
proper
we
way.
can.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, I was saying we can use, like, for example, for testing and all, then we can use VSC and all, right? Because it's just like for testing purpose. So Visual Studio Code and all, we can use that as well to deploy the code in
Oh
Azure
yeah,
function.
you're right. I think there are some extensions you can add to Visual Studio
I
Code, which
believe
will
so. Yeah,
which
I
will help you on
guess.
that. But the way I do it's through a proper pipeline, because you have what is the word? You have um,
Proper structure.
no. Sorry, I was looking for a word, but you have a consistent way to build and expected outcomes. So that's what I was trying to say.
That's true. In fact, I had a podcast, a few podcasts ago that was on IAC and automation via pipelines, and that was actually the discussion that it just in order to maintain consistency and efficiency in your code, I
Hmm.
think it's always best to use like Azure DevOps and all, right? So
Yeah,
that's the exact discussion that we actually had a couple of episodes back.
yeah.
All right.
And one more thing to add to it, sorry. Sometimes you won't have access to the client environment, and
Mm-hmm.
you know you will create and test your functions in your Azure subscription. But if you have the scripts, you can provide this as part of the deliverables for the client. So you give them not only the code, not only the compiled, the binaries, I mean, but also the scripts to create the infrastructure, and they will run and execute because you already did in your environment, in your Azure subscription. You know what will generate, and it's easy for the client to do the same in their environment. There will be just the need to replace the subscription and maybe different names for the function, for the function app, sorry, the research group, and so on. But it will be just variable changes, not the script itself.
That is correct. That's absolutely correct. That is the whole purpose and the essence of it, actually. Um, you know, um, Now as we have spoken about Azure Functions, and that it follows the serverless computing thingy, right?
Hmm.
Similar to that, we have other solutions also on Azure. For example, we have Azure Logic Apps,
Hmm.
which more or less work on the similar lines, right? It is also an a serverless integration platform, and then it also works on trigger and events.
Hmm.
So can you just give some you know comparison between logic app and functions? You know, just like how should one make a decision? We should go in for what particular solution and for what reason? And the reason I've taken this question is because we have almost reached towards the end of the podcast, and I think this would be a good question to end the podcast with, because we have already deep dived into Azure Functions, what it is all about, why, the working of it, the costing part as well. But if we can just take this up and if you can just throw some more light on it.
Yeah. So let's explain a little bit about logic apps. So with logic apps, you can create workflows and integrate with uh, Microsoft services, but also third-party services. For example, let's say you want to integrate with Salesforce, right? You can either go to their portal, create a developer API or something like that, and code yourself how to interact with their APIs, or you can leverage Logic Apps where there will be a what it's called connector. The connector is a mix of how to authenticate to their API and the logic associated to that particular version of the API. So it's already coded for you and ready to use. All you need to do is, drag and drop that connector and maybe set up the connection. Maybe you already have the API key or whatever, username and password. So you just use that to authenticate, and then the integration with the API it's already there in Logic Apps, right? But
Right.
you can also code yourself how to interact with API, and then you can use Azure Functions for that, for example. So the main difference is you can leverage Microsoft and the existing connectors to save time and also to make sure whenever there's a change in the logic for that API, it will be already handled by the connector, or you can do it yourself by code using Azure Functions. So to me, it's more like um, how much control you want. You will leverage what it's already there in Logic Apps, or you can do it yourself for some other reason. So you can in one little detail here, you can use both, right? You can leverage Logic Apps and hook Azure Functions into the workflow if you want. For example, sometimes it's a bit harder to parse JSON using Logic Apps, and you can move that responsibility to an Azure function, for example. So, and then just get the response from the Azure function and continue the workflow if you want. So you can use both. It's not one or the other, but in general, I think I already provided the answer. It's more like how much control you want. That's it.
That's right. As you're right. Actually, I have off lately been working on Azure Logic app extensively, like literally on a daily basis almost. And you're right. I think that follows more of a designer concept, right? Though we do have an option of code view as well over there, but
Mhm.
hardly anyone does the coding. It's only if minute changes are to be made via the code, or if you want to push it to IAC, that's when we actually use the code. But else it's just the designer and the connectors that we have, right? It's just like putting the connector, doing an authentication, and that's all about it, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's as you just rightly said. So I could really relate with it because I've been working on it very, often nowadays. That's right. All right, Thiago, we have reached towards the end of the podcast. And firstly, thank you so much for sharing your insights on Azure Functions. And the entire episode was so informative and educative. And it was my honor to have you on the podcast. But before we end, a signing off note from your side.
Yeah. So thanks so much for having me here. Hopefully, it was helpful for your users, and I'm open in case someone else has some question. Feel free to reach out to me and send the question, or send the question to Navika and she'll send to me. More than happy to provide more details in case you need. And one last thing to add is sometimes people get afraid, oh, should I use Azure Functions in production or not? And I would like to add that I do have Azure Functions running for a top Fortune 500 company. So it's in this kind of company, they have really high standards and requirements. So if the function is running there, you can be safe that you can use it. So that's the last thing I would like to add.
Definitely, definitely. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.